What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Well, you get one of the most explosive late-night television moments ever captured on camera. Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist and action star, walked onto Jimmy Kimmel, Live expecting a standard promotional interview. What he got instead was a verbal sparring match that would escalate into something nobody in that studio could have predicted. By the time security was called, careers were hanging in the balance, and one of Hollywood's most respected figures was being escorted off the set. If you want to see how a simple misunderstanding can spiral completely out of control when egos clash at the highest level, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below, telling me which side you think went too far. The evening started exactly as viewers would expect from Jimmy Kimmel Live. After his opening monologue, Kimmel built up the anticipation for his main guest with his usual theatrical flair. Ladies and gentlemen, he's a martial arts legend, an action movie icon, and somehow the toughest guy on the internet without even trying. Please welcome Chuck Norris, Kimmel announced as the audience erupted in applause. Chuck walked out with his characteristic confidence, waving to the crowd before settling into the guest chair. The initial exchange seemed perfectly cordial. "Chuck, great to have you here. How are you doing tonight?" Kimmel asked with his trademark grin. "I'm doing well, Jimmy. Thanks for having me on the show," Norris replied, his voice steady and professional. "Now, I have to ask, do you ever get tired of being known as the toughest man alive according to the internet?" Kimmel continued, clearly, steering toward the viral phenomenon that had made Norris a cultural icon beyond his movies. Chuck shifted slightly in his chair. "Well, I appreciate that people have fun with those jokes, but I'm really here to talk about my new project and some of the foundation work I've been doing." "Oh, we'll get to that," Kimmel said with a dismissive wave. "But come on, you have to admit some of these facts about you are pretty incredible. I mean, they say Chuck Norris doesn't do push-ups, he pushes the earth down." The audience laughed, and Chuck managed a polite smile. "That's creative, I'll give them that." "Here's another good one," Kimmel continued, clearly enjoying himself. "They say when Chuck Norris goes swimming, he doesn't get wet, the water gets Chuck Norrised." "Jimmy," Chuck interjected, his tone becoming more serious, "I really would prefer to focus on the work I'm doing now. I've got a new film coming out, and I'm also working with several military charities that I think your viewers would find interesting." But Kimmel wasn't ready to let go of his chosen direction. "Oh, we'll get to all that boring stuff later. Right now, I want to have some fun. You know what? I actually prepared a whole segment for this. I call it Chuck Norris Fact or Fiction." Kimmel reached under his desk and pulled out a stack of cards, holding them up for the audience to see. The crowd cheered in anticipation. "So here's how this works, Chuck. I'm going to read some of these famous Chuck Norris facts, and you tell me if they're true or false. Simple enough, right?" Chuck's expression had grown noticeably more tense. "Jimmy, I thought we discussed keeping this professional. I'm not really comfortable with this approach." "Come on, don't be such a stick in the mud," Kimmel replied with a laugh. "Your fans love this stuff. Look at them, they're eating it up." He gestured to the audience, who were indeed still applauding and cheering, though some seemed to sense the growing tension between host and guest. "All right, let's start with an easy one," Kimmel said, reading from his first card. "Chuck Norris once ate a whole cake before his friends could tell him there was a stripper in it. True or false?" The audience burst into laughter, but Chuck's face remained stone serious. "That's not even remotely true, and frankly, it's not the kind of humor I want to be associated with." "Oh, lighten up a little," Kimmel shot back. "It's just a joke. Here's another one. Chuck Norris can kill 2 stones with 1 bird. True or false?" "Jimmy, I'm asking you to move on from this segment," Chuck said firmly. "This isn't what I agreed to when I came on your show." "What you agreed to?" Kimmel repeated, his voice taking on a slightly mocking tone. "Chuck, you're on late-night television. This is what we do here. We have fun, we make jokes, we entertain people. You can't expect to come on here and just give some boring interview about your charity work." The audience was starting to murmur among themselves, sensing that this exchange was moving beyond typical late-night banter into something more uncomfortable. Chuck leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to a more serious register. "Jimmy, respect is important to me. I've built my career and my reputation on certain principles, and I expect those to be honored when I appear on shows like this." "Respect?" Kimmel laughed. "Chuck, with all due respect, these internet jokes are probably the best thing that ever happened to your career. I mean, when was your last movie, like 15 years ago? These memes made you relevant again." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence. Even the audience seemed to realize that Kimmel had just crossed a line that probably shouldn't have been crossed. Chuck's eyes flashed with an anger that was unmistakable to anyone watching. "Jimmy, I need you to be very careful about what you say next." "Or what?" Kimmel replied, apparently not reading the warning signs. "You're going to roundhouse kick me? Come on, Chuck, you're 70-something years old. The tough guy act is getting a little old, don't you think?" That was the moment everything changed. Chuck Norris slowly rose from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled, but unmistakably threatening. The audience gasped collectively, and even Kimmel seemed to realize he might have pushed too far. Chuck Norris stood at his full height, towering over the seated talk show host. The studio had gone completely silent, with even the band members putting down their instruments to watch what was unfolding. Kimmel's usual cocky demeanor seemed to falter for just a moment as he looked up at the martial arts legend. "Sit down, Chuck," Kimmel said, trying to regain control of the situation with a nervous laugh. "You're scaring the audience." "I'm not sitting down until you show me the respect I deserve," Chuck replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had commanded movie sets for decades. "You invited me onto your show, and then you deliberately ignored my requests about how I wanted to be presented." Kimmel shifted uncomfortably in his chair but tried to maintain his composure. "Look, I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, but this is comedy. This is what we do here. People expect entertainment, not some serious interview about your charity work that nobody cares about." The audience gasped audibly at that comment. Several people could be heard murmuring disapprovingly, and some were shaking their heads. Chuck's expression grew even more intense. "Nobody cares about helping veterans? Nobody cares about the work I do with military families? You think that's less important than your cheap jokes?" "That's not what I meant," Kimmel backpedaled quickly. "I just meant that people tune in for fun, not for some heavy conversation about serious issues." "Then maybe you should have told me that before I agreed to come on your show," Chuck shot back, "because I was told this would be a respectful interview where I could discuss my current projects and the causes I support." Kimmel seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation, but instead of backing down, he made another critical error. "Chuck, you need to understand something. This is my show. I decide what we talk about, not you. You're the guest here." "Your show?" Chuck repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Jimmy, let me explain something to you. I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I've earned my place here through hard work, dedication, and treating people with respect. You've earned your place by making jokes at other people's expense." "That's what comedians do," Kimmel fired back, his own temper starting to flare. "We make jokes. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be doing television interviews." "I can handle jokes," Chuck replied firmly. "What I can't handle is someone who breaks their word and then acts like I'm the problem for expecting basic professionalism." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Audience members were looking around nervously, unsure whether this was still part of the show or if they were witnessing a genuine confrontation. Kimmel stood up from behind his desk, apparently deciding to match Chuck's physical presence. "You know what your problem is, Chuck? You take yourself way too seriously. You act like you're some kind of living legend when really you're just an old action star who got lucky with internet memes." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Chuck's hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment it looked like the situation might turn physical. "Jimmy," Chuck said slowly, "I've been called a lot of things in my life, but lucky isn't one of them. Everything I've achieved, I've worked for. Every skill I've developed, I've earned through discipline and dedication. What have you earned through anything other than putting other people down?" "I've earned one of the most successful late-night shows on television," Kimmel replied defensively. "I've interviewed presidents, movie stars, and yes, even washed up action heroes who should be grateful for the platform I'm giving them." "Washed up?" Chuck repeated, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. "Jimmy, I'm 70 years old and I could still put you on the ground in about 3 seconds. Age doesn't wash up skill. It refines it." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word of this unprecedented exchange. "Are you threatening me?" Kimmel asked, trying to sound indignant but clearly rattled. "I'm not threatening you," Chuck replied calmly. "I'm educating you. There's a difference between confidence and arrogance, between humor and disrespect, between being a host and being a bully." "A bully?" Kimmel laughed, but it sounded forced. "Chuck, you're the one standing over me making threats about putting me on the ground. Who's the bully here?" "The bully is the person who invites someone onto their show under false pretenses, ignores their clearly stated boundaries, and then acts like they're the victim when called out on it," Chuck responded without hesitation. Kimmel seemed to realize that the audience was not on his side. Several people were nodding in agreement with Chuck's words, and the uncomfortable silence was broken only by scattered murmurs of support for the martial arts legend. "Fine," Kimmel said, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "You want to talk about your charity work? Let's talk about your charity work. But first tell me, when did you become such a sensitive prima donna?" That was the final straw. Chuck Norris had spent decades building a reputation based on integrity, respect, and professionalism. Being called a prima donna on national television by someone who had already broken their agreement was more than he was willing to tolerate. "Jimmy," Chuck said with deadly calm, "I think this interview is over." "Oh, you think so?" Kimmel replied, sarcastically. "Well, let me tell you something, Chuck. You don't get to decide when this interview is over. This is my show, and you signed a contract to be here." Chuck smiled for the first time since the confrontation began, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Jimmy, I've read a lot of contracts in my career, and I've never signed one that required me to sit here and be disrespected by someone who clearly has no idea what professionalism means." Chuck's mention of the contract seemed to unnerve Kimmel more than anything else that had been said. The host's face flushed red as he realized that his guest might actually have legal grounds to walk away from the interview. "You can't just leave," Kimmel said, his voice rising slightly. "We have a whole show to fill, and you're the main guest. People tuned in to see you. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to turn this into a circus," Chuck replied evenly. "The people who tuned in to see me deserve better than watching you make a fool of yourself on national television." The camera operators were clearly unsure whether to keep filming or cut away. The show's producers could be seen frantically talking into their headsets from the wings of the stage. "I'm making a fool of myself?" Kimmel shot back. "Chuck, you're the one, having a meltdown over a few harmless jokes. Do you know how many guests come on this show and laugh along with this kind of thing?" "Then maybe you should have booked one of them instead of me," Chuck said simply. "Because I'm not laughing, and I'm not playing along with your disrespectful games." Kimmel took a step closer to Chuck, apparently trying to use intimidation tactics, despite being clearly outmatched physically. "You know what I think this is really about? I think you're embarrassed that your career peaked 20 years ago, and now the only way people remember you is through internet jokes." The audience actually gasped at this comment. Several people could be heard saying, "Oh no," and "That's too far," under their breath. Chuck's response was swift and cutting. "Jimmy, my career has spanned over 4 decades. I've starred in successful television series, major motion pictures, and built multiple businesses. I've written books, supported countless charities, and earned the respect of my peers in Hollywood and the martial arts community. What exactly have you accomplished besides sitting behind that desk and making jokes about people who are actually out there doing things? I've accomplished building one of the most successful shows on late-night television, Kimmel replied defensively. I've won awards, I've interviewed everyone who matters in entertainment, and I make millions of people laugh every night. Making people laugh is a noble profession, Chuck acknowledged. But there's a difference between making people laugh with you and making them laugh at someone else's expense. Real comedians know the difference. Real comedians? Kimmel repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, so now you're an expert on comedy too? Is there anything you don't know everything about? I know about respect, Chuck said firmly. I know about keeping your word. I know about treating people with dignity, especially when they're guests in your house. Apparently those are lessons you never learned. The band leader, who had been watching this entire exchange with growing concern, finally motioned to his musicians to pack up their instruments. The uncomfortable silence in the studio was becoming unbearable for everyone involved. Kimmel seemed to realize he was losing the audience completely. Desperate to regain control, he made perhaps his biggest mistake of the entire evening. You know what, Chuck? Maybe the internet got it wrong. Maybe Chuck Norris facts should be about how Chuck Norris can't take a joke, or how Chuck Norris throws tantrums when things don't go his way. The martial arts legend's eyes narrowed dangerously. Jimmy, I've been very patient with you tonight. I've tried to handle this professionally despite your continued disrespect. But if you think I'm going to stand here and let you create false narratives about who I am, you're mistaken. False narratives? Kimmel laughed mockingly. Chuck, everyone watching this can see exactly who you are. You're a has-been action star who can't handle a little ribbing from a comedian. No, Jimmy, Chuck replied with deadly calm. What everyone watching this can see is a host who breaks his agreements with guests, shows no respect for the people who make his show possible, and then plays victim when he gets called out for his unprofessional behavior. The audience was clearly on Chuck's side now. Several people were nodding in agreement, and there were scattered calls of, "Tell him, Chuck," and "You're right," from various sections of the studio. Kimmel, perhaps realizing that he had completely lost the crowd, decided to make one final attempt to salvage the situation. Look, Chuck, maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Why don't you sit back down, and we can start over? Chuck shook his head slowly. Jimmy, some things can't be undone. You've shown me exactly who you are tonight, and you've shown your audience, too. I don't think starting over is going to change that. So what, you're just going to walk out? Kimmel asked, desperation creeping into his voice. You're going to leave me here to fill the rest of the show by myself? That's exactly what I'm going to do, Chuck confirmed. Because unlike you, when I give my word about something, I keep it. And I gave my word to myself a long time ago, that I wouldn't allow anyone to disrespect me or the things I care about, regardless of the circumstances. Chuck began to move toward the edge of the stage, but Kimmel wasn't ready to let him go. Fine, walk out, Kimmel called after him. But don't think this makes you look good. Don't think you're some kind of hero here. You're just a difficult guest who couldn't handle a little comedy. Chuck stopped and turned back to face Kimmel one last time. Jimmy, I've been in combat. I've faced real challenges, real adversity, real danger. Your idea of comedy isn't challenging or difficult to handle. It's just sad. What's difficult is watching someone with your platform wasted on petty insults instead of using it to lift people up. Oh, spare me the lecture about using my platform, Kimmel shot back. This coming from someone whose biggest contribution to society is internet memes about how tough he is. That comment seemed to strike a nerve with several audience members, who began booing for the first time during the entire confrontation. Chuck's final response was delivered with the dignity and composure that had defined his entire career. Jimmy, my contributions to society include decades of supporting military families, veterans organizations, and educational programs. I've used my platform to promote physical fitness, personal discipline, and respect for others. If you think internet memes are my biggest contribution, then you clearly haven't been paying attention to anything I've actually done with my life. As Chuck walked toward the edge of the stage, Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. "Security," he called out. "Don't let him leave the studio." Chuck paused and looked back at the host with something approaching pity. "Jimmy, you're really going to have security escort a 70-year-old man out of your studio because he wouldn't let you make fun of his military charity work?" The security guards who had appeared looked extremely uncomfortable with the situation. They clearly respected Chuck Norris and seemed reluctant to physically remove him from the premises. "It's all right, gentlemen," Chuck said to the security team with his characteristic grace. "I was leaving anyway. Thank you for your service tonight." As Chuck Norris walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage for the final time, the audience erupted in applause. Not the polite applause typically heard at the end of interviews, but the kind of sustained, enthusiastic applause reserved for someone who has just demonstrated real character under pressure. Jimmy Kimmel was left standing alone on his stage, facing an audience that was clearly disappointed in his behavior, and a camera crew that had just captured one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. So there you have it. The night that Chuck Norris proved that real toughness isn't about physical strength or martial arts skills. Sometimes, real toughness is about standing up for your principles when it would be easier to just go along with the crowd. What do you think? Did Chuck Norris handle this situation correctly? Or should he have just laughed along with Jimmy's jokes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more incredible stories like this. 1.